Everyone at that table laughed when my own son said those words to me. Then the waiter walked over and set a bill for $5,000 right in front of my chair, like it was already decided who was paying. I looked at my son. I looked at that bill. Then I slid it back across the table without saying a single word, and I stood up and walked out. Nobody sitting at that table that night knew whose money had actually built the restaurant they were eating in. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm 58 years old. I've been a contractor my whole life, the kind of guy who fixes roofs and pours foundations, and comes home smelling like sawdust and sweat. I raised my son Tyler mostly on my own after his mother left when he was 10. I'm not a rich man by the way I dress or the truck I drive, but I built more than people ever knew, and that night at the restaurant is where all of it finally came apart. Carol left in the spring when Tyler was 10 years old. She didn't leave because of anything dramatic. She just decided she wanted a different life than the one we had in our small house on Ridge Lane outside Denver, and one day her closet was empty and her car was gone from the driveway. I didn't chase her. I had a boy who needed breakfast made, and a lunch packed, and someone to sit through his baseball games in a folding chair, so that's what I did. I worked construction jobs from 6 in the morning until the light gave out. And then I came home and made sure Tyler had clean clothes for school and somebody who showed up to every parent-teacher conference, even the ones where the teacher just wanted to complain about him talking too much in class. Money was never easy. I remember stretching a single paycheck across 3 weeks more than once, eating the same box of pasta 4 nights in a row so Tyler could have the good cereal instead of the store brand. I never told him any of that. I wanted him to grow up thinking things were fine, because that's what a father does. He grew up watching me leave the house in steel-toed boots covered in drywall dust, and I think somewhere in there, without me noticing it happening, he started to feel a little embarrassed by that. Kids don't always know how to separate a hard life from a small life. Tyler mixed the two up early, and I didn't catch it until it was already sitting deep inside him. By the time he was in high school, he'd stopped inviting friends over to the house. He said it was because our place was too small, but I think it was really about the truck parked out front with my company name painted on the door, Marsh Contracting, and the ladders strapped to the roof rack. I never said anything about it. I figured it was a phase, the kind of thing boys grow out of once they get older and understand what actually matters. I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't find out how wrong for almost 15 more years. Tyler found his real passion in the kitchen, and it happened almost by accident. He got a summer job washing dishes at a diner near our house when he was 16, just to make some spending money, and within a month he was begging the cook to let him near the grill. He came home talking about knife skills and sauce reductions, like other kids talked about video games. I remember standing in our kitchen, watching him try to make a béarnaise sauce from a library book, breaking it twice and starting over without complaining once. I thought, this is it. This is the thing that lights him up. And I told him I'd back him no matter what it cost. He went to a culinary program 2 states over, and I covered what his scholarships didn't touch. I picked up extra jobs on weekends, small remodels and deck repairs, anything that paid cash, and I never let him see the strain of it. When he graduated, he came home with a diploma and a head full of plans, wanting to open his own place instead of working his way up in somebody else's kitchen for 10 years like everybody told him to do. He was 26. No credit history worth mentioning, and every bank in Denver turned him down flat when he tried to get a business loan on his own. That's when he came to me one night at the kitchen table, nervous in a way I hadn't seen since he was a kid, asking to borrow the car. He needed collateral. He needed somebody with a paid-off house and decent credit to put their name on the line, and there was only one person in his life who fit that description. I didn't hesitate. I'd spent my whole life building things with my hands, and here was a chance to help him build something with his. I told him yes before he even finished the sentence, and I meant it completely. I had no idea that yes would end up costing me more than money. I remortgaged the house on Ridge Lane, the same house I'd paid off free and clear 6 years earlier after 2 decades of work. I signed a personal guarantee on a business loan for $2.4 million, which is a number that still makes my stomach tighten when I say it out loud. The bank wanted more than just a signature, though. They wanted real ownership tied to the guarantee, something with teeth behind it. So my lawyer set up an LLC where I held 40% of the restaurant, quiet and on paper only, while Tyler held the rest and ran everything day to day. Tyler asked me for one more thing that night, and looking back, I think that request told me everything I needed to know if I'd been willing to hear it. He asked if we could keep my ownership stake quiet, out of the public story. He said investors and customers liked a founder narrative, a young guy who built something out of nothing through grit and talent alone, and having his contractor father listed as a 40% owner would complicate that story. He wanted people to believe he'd done it himself. I told myself it was just business strategy, the kind of thing young entrepreneurs think about branding, and I agreed to stay silent. The restaurant was called Copperline Kitchen, and it opened on a corner lot in the Highlands neighborhood with exposed brick and hanging copper lights that Tyler had designed himself. I stood in the back of the room on opening night, dressed in the one good sport coat I owned, and I watched my son shake hands with reviewers and local business owners like he'd been born into that world. Nobody introduced me as anything more than a family friend who'd come to support him. I told myself it didn't matter, that watching him succeed was payment enough, and for a long time I actually believed that. I didn't understand yet how much a lie like that grows once you let it live in a room long enough. Copperline Kitchen took off faster than either of us expected. Within 3 years, Tyler had opened 2 more locations, one downtown and one out toward Cherry Creek, and food magazines started writing him up as one of Denver's rising culinary names. The self-made kid who built an empire out of a single corner lot with nothing but talent and nerve. Every article told some version of that same story, and every time I read one, I noticed my name wasn't in it anywhere. Not even a mention of a father who'd remortgaged his house to make it possible. I told myself it was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine back then. It was around that time Tyler met Vanessa Whitmore at a fundraiser one of his restaurants catered. The Whitmores were old Denver money, the kind of family with a name on a wing of the art museum and a summer place up near Vail that had been in the family since the 50s. Richard Whitmore, Vanessa's father, had built a real estate empire that made my 40% of a restaurant look like pocket change. And he was the sort of man who valued legacy and self-reliance above almost everything else. Tyler fell into that world easily, wearing it like it had always fit him. When Tyler and Vanessa got married the following year at a vineyard outside Boulder, I sat at a table near the back with a handful of Tyler's old culinary school friends, while I watched him introduce me to Richard Whitmore, simply as an old family friend who'd helped him out early on. Not his father, just a friend. I remember shaking Richard's hand and smiling, and saying it was a beautiful ceremony, while something inside my chest quietly cracked in a place I didn't have words for yet. I told myself Tyler had his reasons, that maybe it would change once the wedding excitement settled down. It never did. It only got worse from there, and I let it. Because I still believed being needed quietly was better than not being needed at all. 5 years passed that way, with me showing up to birthdays and holidays as a background figure Tyler barely acknowledged in front of the Whitmores, and me telling myself every single time that it was fine. Then in the spring, Tyler called and invited me to a dinner celebrating Richard Whitmore's 60th birthday, being held at the flagship Copperline Kitchen location downtown. He said it mattered to him that I be there, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel a small flicker of hope that maybe something had shifted, that maybe this time he'd introduce me properly. I'd been out on a job that whole week, patching a roof for a family whose place had taken storm damage, and I didn't have time to drive home and change before heading to the restaurant. I showed up in my work jacket and boots, dust still on my jeans, because I figured Tyler's dinner invitation meant more than clothes ever could. I drove 3 hours from a job site outside Fort Collins straight to that restaurant, tired and hungry and genuinely excited to see my son and the grandkids I barely got time with anymore, walking up to the entrance of Copperline Kitchen downtown, the place Tyler had built with my signature and my house as collateral. I felt a strange kind of pride mixed with nervousness, the same feeling I used to get walking Tyler into his first day of school. Through the big front windows I could see the private dining room in back, decorated with white flowers and candles, the whole Whitmore family gathered in expensive clothes around a long table, laughing about something, champagne glasses catching the light. I straightened my jacket as best I could, took a breath, and walked through the front door toward my son and whatever was waiting for me at that table. The hostess recognized me right away and waved me back toward the private room without even checking a list, since I'd been in that restaurant enough times over the years that most of the staff knew my face. Walking into that room felt like stepping into a different world, all soft candlelight and expensive perfume, The Whitmores dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine, Richard at the head of the table in a dark blazer, laughing at something his son-in-law had just said. Tyler spotted me first. I watched his face change as well. The smile he'd been wearing for his in-laws sliding sideways into something tighter and more careful. He stood up fast, almost knocking his chair, and crossed the room toward me before I'd even made it halfway to the table. "Dad," he said, low and quick, like he was trying to keep the words contained to just the two of us. "What are you doing here like that?" I told him I'd come straight from a job, that I didn't have time to change, and that I was sorry if my clothes weren't right for the room. He looked back over his shoulder at the Whitmore table, and I watched Vanessa's mother lean toward another woman and say something behind her hand, both of them glancing our way. Richard Whitmore was watching too, his expression unreadable in that particular way rich men get when they're deciding whether something is beneath their attention. Tyler's jaw tightened, and I could see him doing some kind of math in his head, weighing his father against the family he'd married into, and I could see exactly which side of that equation he was landing on before he even opened his mouth again. The warmth I'd felt walking in, the small hope I'd been carrying from Fort Collins all the way to Denver, started draining out of me right there in the doorway, 3 hours of driving suddenly sitting heavy in my legs. Tyler's voice came out sharper than I'd ever heard him use with me, loud enough that it carried across the whole private room. "Dad, this table is for our family. You can wait outside." For a second I just stood there, not fully understanding the words, even though I'd heard every one of them clearly. This table is for our family. Like I was some stranger who'd wandered in off the street looking for a handout, like 32 years of raising him alone, counted for nothing next to how I looked standing in a doorway in work boots. Somebody at the table laughed first. A short surprised sound that broke the silence, and then it spread, 2 or 3 more voices joining in, not cruel exactly. More the careless kind of laughter people give when they think a joke has been made at somebody else's expense and they don't want to be the one who doesn't get it. Richard Whitmore didn't laugh, but he didn't say anything either, just watched with that same unreadable expression, 60 years old and comfortable enough in his own skin to let the moment play out without interference. I looked past Tyler at that long table full of candles and champagne glasses, at Vanessa not quite meeting my eyes, at grandkids I loved more than almost anything in this world, sitting there confused about why Grandpa wasn't sitting down. Nobody at that table knew that the walls around them, the copper lights hanging from the ceiling, the kitchen turning out plates behind that door, existed because I'd signed my name and my house over to a bank 6 years earlier. Nobody knew, because Tyler had made very sure of that from the very beginning. Standing in that doorway, I felt something shift inside me, quiet and cold and absolutely clear, the kind of feeling that doesn't come from anger so much as finally seeing something exactly as it is. I didn't argue with him. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene, because that's not who I am, and it never has been. I just nodded once, slow, and started to turn toward the door, telling myself I'd wait in the truck until it was over. Or maybe just drive home and let the whole thing go the way I'd let so many things go over the years. That's when Marco, the head waiter who'd worked at Copperline since the very first location opened and who'd seen me at more of these family gatherings than Tyler probably remembered, came around the corner carrying a small leather folder. Out of pure habit. The kind built over years of watching me quietly settle the bill at family dinners. Whenever Tyler was too busy managing the kitchen to notice, Marco walked straight past Tyler and set that folder down at the one open seat near where I'd been standing. He didn't even look up, just said the total's 5,200, whenever you're ready, Mr. Marsh, and turned to head back toward the kitchen, completely unaware of what had just happened 30 seconds earlier in that room. I looked down at that folder sitting there on the white tablecloth, and something about it landed different than it ever had before. $5,000 for a table I'd just been told wasn't mine, in a restaurant that existed because of money and risk that had come entirely from me. I opened the folder, looked at the number, then closed it again and slid it back across the table toward Tyler, without saying a word, my eyes staying on him the whole time. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. I turned, walked past the confused faces and the flickering candles, out through the private room door, past the hostess stand, and out into the cold Denver night, leaving that folded bill sitting exactly where I'd left it. The drive home was quiet in a way I'd never experienced before, not angry quiet, but something deeper and stiller than that. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove through the dark with my hands steady on the wheel, replaying the whole scene over and over, the laughter, Richard Whitmore's unreadable face, Marco setting that folder down without knowing what he was walking into. By the time I pulled into my driveway on Ridge Lane an hour later, something inside me had gone completely still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. I sat in my truck in the dark for a long time before going inside. I thought about Carol leaving all those years ago and how I'd never let myself fall apart in front of Tyler, how I'd swallowed every hard thing quietly so he'd never have to carry any of it. I thought about remortgaging this exact house, about signing a $2.4 million personal guarantee at a bank downtown, while a loan officer half my age explained the risk to me like I hadn't already understood it completely. I thought about being introduced as an old family friend at my own son's wedding. Around 11 that night, I picked up my phone and called Gerald Finch, an old friend from my rec league softball team, who also happened to be a business attorney with 30 years of experience handling exactly this kind of thing. Gerald picked up on the third ring, his voice rough with sleep, and asked what was wrong, because I never called that late, unless something was actually wrong. I told him I needed to come by his office first thing in the morning, that I needed him to pull the paperwork on an LLC called Copperline Holdings, and that I needed to understand exactly what rights I still had as a 40% owner who'd been treated like he owned nothing at all. Gerald's office was in a converted brick building near downtown, the kind of place with worn leather chairs and framed diplomas that had been up so long the corners had yellowed. I sat across from him the next morning while he spread the Copperline Holdings paperwork across his desk, the same documents I'd signed 6 years earlier, without reading every line as closely as I probably should have. Gerald read through it slowly, tapping certain pages, asking me questions about what exactly had happened at that dinner, and I told him the whole thing without leaving anything out. He found what he was looking for about 20 minutes in, tapping a clause in the operating agreement with the end of his pen. "Daniel," he said, looking up at me over his reading glasses, "your personal guarantee on that original loan isn't permanent. It's tied to an annual renewal the bank requires because the collateral is your house, and it comes up for review again in 8 weeks. You also have a buy-sell clause here that lets you force a valuation and either buy out the other partner's share or sell yours, if certain conditions are met, including material misrepresentation of ownership to third parties." Which sounds like exactly what's been happening with these magazine articles and everything else. I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling something settle into place inside me. I told Gerald I wanted to withdraw my personal guarantee when the renewal came up, formally in writing, through the proper channels, no shouting, no drama. Just the plain legal mechanics of a man removing his name from something he never should have hidden behind in the first place. I also asked him to draft a letter invoking the buy-sell clause, giving Tyler the option to buy out my 40% at fair market value within 90 days, or the whole ownership structure would be forced into public record through the standard filing process. Gerald nodded slowly, and told me he'd have the paperwork ready within the week. For the first time since walking out of that restaurant, I felt something close to calm. The renewal letter went out from the bank exactly on schedule. 8 weeks later, informing Copperline Holdings that the personal guarantee backing their original $2.4 million loan would not be renewed under the current terms, and that the business would need to secure new collateral or a new guarantor within 30 days to avoid the loan being called for immediate repayment. I found out later from Gerald that Tyler's loan officer called him directly the same afternoon the letter arrived, walking him through exactly whose signature had been holding the whole structure together since day one. Tyler had never actually looked closely at those original loan documents. Not really. He'd signed where Gerald and I told him to sign back when he was 26 and desperate to open his first restaurant, trusting that his father had handled the details the way I'd handled every detail of his life up to that point. Now 6 years later, sitting across from a loan officer explaining that the entire financial foundation of his 3 restaurants rested on his father's house and his father's credit, Tyler was hearing the full truth of his own success story for the very first time. According to Gerald, who'd gotten a call from the bank's legal department confirming receipt of our buy-sell letter that same week, Tyler went pale sitting in that meeting and asked to see the original documents pulled up on screen. He apparently sat there in silence for almost a full minute, staring at my signature on page after page, at the house on Ridge Lane listed as collateral, at the 40% ownership stake that had been sitting quietly in his father's name since before Copperline Kitchen ever opened its doors. Whatever story he'd built about himself over the past 6 years, the self-made narrative he'd fed to reporters and in-laws alike, was sitting right there in black and white, completely unraveling in front of him. Tyler called me 11 times over the next 2 days, and I let every single call go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I genuinely had nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in that restaurant doorway. On the third day, he showed up at my house, unannounced, standing on the porch where I'd stood so many times waiting for him to come home from school, except now the roles felt strange, and reversed in a way neither of us was used to. He looked different than he had at that dinner, the polish worn thin, dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept properly in days. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk about the bank letter, about the buy-sell thing your lawyer sent." I invited him in, made 2 cups of coffee the same way I always had, and sat across from him at the same kitchen table, where he'd once asked me to sign my life over to help him chase his dream. He asked me why I was doing this now, after everything, after all the years I'd stayed quiet, and let things be however he needed them to be. I told him the truth, plain and steady, the way I'd learned to say hard things over a lifetime of not saying them soon enough. I told him I wasn't doing anything to him. I was just done doing something for him that he'd never once acknowledged. Done being a silent partner in a life where I wasn't even allowed to sit at the table. I told him that pulling my guarantee wasn't revenge. It was just me finally treating my own name and my own house the way he'd taught me he treated me, as something to be used quietly and kept out of sight when convenient. He sat there for a long time without answering, staring into his coffee, and for the first time in years, I watched my son actually run out of words. Word travels fast in circles like the Whitmores, and within 2 weeks of that bank letter going out, Richard Whitmore had heard the whole story, not from me, but from his own attorney, who'd gotten wind of the loan situation through mutual contacts in Denver's business community. Richard called Tyler directly one evening and asked him, point blank, whether it was true that the entire Copperline Kitchen empire had been built on his father's personal guarantee and hidden ownership stake this entire time, the same father Tyler had introduced at his own wedding as nothing more than an old family friend. I heard about this conversation secondhand, weeks later, through Vanessa, who called me one afternoon sounding shaken in a way I'd never heard from her before. She told me her father had always respected self-made success above almost anything else in this world, that it was the entire foundation of how the Whitmore family measured a man's worth, and that discovering Tyler's success had actually been quietly financed and guaranteed by a father he'd erased from the public story had shifted something permanently in how Richard viewed his son-in-law. Vanessa said her father used the word disappointed, which apparently in that family carried more weight than anger ever could. Richard Whitmore, I learned, had built his own real estate empire from nothing after his own father lost the family's original fortune in the 80s, and the one thing he could not stand, above dishonesty about money, above almost any other flaw a man could have, was a person who erased the people who'd actually made his success possible. Tyler had spent 6 years building an image of himself as exactly that kind of self-made man in front of exactly the kind of family who valued that story more than almost anything else. And now the whole foundation of that image had cracked open in front of the very people whose respect he'd been chasing the entire time. The Copperline Kitchen downtown location, the same one where I'd been told I didn't belong at my own family's table, closed within 4 months, without my guarantee backing the loan, and without Tyler having built enough personal credit history or savings of his own after years of living, like a man who'd always assumed his father's name would quietly cover whatever gaps appeared. The bank called the loan when Tyler couldn't secure new collateral in time. The Cherry Creek location followed 2 months after that, and only the original corner location in the Highlands survived, scaled back and running with a skeleton staff. Vanessa didn't leave him, but something between them had changed permanently, the way she told it to me later. She said discovering the truth about the restaurants had made her look back at their entire marriage differently, wondering what else Tyler had let her believe that wasn't quite the full story. Richard Whitmore, according to Vanessa, had pulled back significantly from the informal business introductions and social capital he used to offer Tyler freely. The kind of quiet advantages that come with marrying into a family like that, treating him now with a careful, watchful distance instead of the easy warmth he'd shown before. Tyler lost weight over those months. Showed up to a few family gatherings looking smaller somehow, the confidence that used to fill a room now replaced by something more careful and uncertain. I didn't take any pleasure in watching it happen, and I want to be honest about that, because I'd spent too many years loving that boy to feel good about any part of his life falling apart. But I also didn't step in to soften any of it, because for the first time in his adult life, Tyler was standing in front of consequences that belonged entirely to him, built from choices he'd made without me standing quietly behind him, covering the gaps. Tyler came back to Ridge Lane on a Sunday afternoon in early fall, parking his car on the street instead of the driveway like he used to, and knocked on the front door instead of just walking in the way he'd done his whole life growing up in that house. I opened the door and found him standing there in a plain jacket. No polish left in how he carried himself, just a tired man in his 30s who looked, for the first time in a long while, like he actually wanted to say something true. We sat on the back porch where I used to watch him practice, pitching into an old mattress leaned against the fence, and he talked for almost an hour without me interrupting once. He told me he'd been ashamed of where we came from since he was a kid, ashamed of the truck and the work boots and the small house, and that shame had turned into something uglier over the years, a need to erase the parts of his story that felt too plain for the world he wanted to belong to. He said he understood now that erasing me from that story meant erasing the only person who'd ever shown up for him without conditions. And he said he was sorry in a way that didn't sound rehearsed or convenient, just plain and a little broken. I told him I appreciated hearing that, and that I believed him, but that things weren't going back to exactly how they'd been before that dinner. I told him if he wanted me in his life going forward, it would have to be as his father, out loud, in front of whoever happened to be sitting at the table, not as a quiet arrangement he pulled out when it was useful and hid away when it wasn't. He nodded, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he reached over and hugged me the way he used to as a kid, not performing anything for anyone, just two people sitting on a porch trying to find their way back to something honest. It's been almost a year now since that dinner at Copperline Kitchen, and things look different than they used to, though not in the way the magazines would have written it before. Tyler runs the one remaining restaurant location himself, without my guarantee behind it anymore, working the kind of long hours I used to work back when he was a kid watching me leave the house before sunrise. He calls me most weeks now, actually calls, not just when something's needed, and last month he introduced me to a new supplier at the restaurant as my dad. Plain and simple, no old family friend, no careful editing of the truth. Richard Whitmore and I have actually spoken a handful of times since everything settled, and I found him to be a more decent man than that first impression at the birthday dinner suggested. Someone who respects a person more once he understands what they actually built with their own two hands. He told me once, over coffee Tyler had arranged awkwardly between us, that he wished he'd known the real story years earlier. That a contractor who remortgaged his house for his son's dream deserved more respect at that table than most of the people who'd been laughing that night ever did. I still drive the same old truck. I still come home most days covered in dust from whatever job I'm working. But I sit at family tables now without wondering whether I actually belong there, because Tyler finally understands what it costs to build the life he has. And he's stopped pretending that cost might belong to him alone. Sometimes I think back to standing in that restaurant doorway, hearing my own son tell me to wait outside, and I realize that moment didn't destroy anything that was actually worth keeping. It just finally showed me, clear as anything, exactly what needed to change, and gave me the push to change it.